Most men believe the way to stay on a woman's mind is simple: talk more, text more, try harder. They think if they just say the right things often enough, she'll eventually start thinking about them the same way. But here's the truth: most people never realize. The men she actually remembers are usually not the ones who tried the hardest. They're the ones who said something small, simple, and unexpected, something that stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Think about this for a second. Have you ever had someone say something to you, just a few words, but for some reason it stuck in your mind the entire day? You couldn't explain why, but it kept coming back, replaying itself quietly when everything else went silent. That's not random. That's how the mind works. People don't remember effort, they remember impact. And when it comes to attraction, impact doesn't come from talking more. It comes from saying something that creates a feeling. Because at the end of the day, a woman doesn't sit there every message you sent her. She remembers how you made her feel in that moment. That's what stays. That's what lingers. That's what pulls her back to thinking about you even when you're not around. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There are certain ways of speaking that trigger this effect naturally. Not because they are complicated, not because they are perfect, but because they connect with something deeper than logic. They don't just sound good, they feel different. And once you understand this, everything about the way you communicate begins to change. You stop trying to impress, you stop overthinking every word, and instead you start creating moments that actually stay in her mind. That's what this video is really about. Not tricks, not lines, not pretending to be someone you're not, but understanding the psychology behind why some words disappear instantly while others stay with someone long after the conversation is over. Before we go deeper, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments. I always find it interesting seeing how far these ideas reach and how people from different parts of the world experience attraction differently. Now, if most men are trying harder and still being forgotten, then the real question becomes, what are they doing wrong? If you really pay attention to how most men approach attraction, you'll start to notice a pattern. They believe more effort equals more interest. So what do? They send more messages. They explain themselves more. They try harder to be funny, more interesting, more impressive. And on the surface, it seems logical. If you want someone to think about you, you should give them more of you, right? But in reality, the opposite often happens. The more you try to force attention, the less impact you actually create. Because attraction doesn't grow from effort. It grows from how something makes someone feel. Think about it this way. If a woman receives 10 messages from you in a day, what happens? At first, she might respond. Then she gets used to it. Then it becomes normal, and eventually it becomes predictable. And once something becomes predictable, the brain stops paying attention to it. That's the part most men completely miss. The human mind is not designed to remember everything. It filters out what feels routine and focuses only on what feels different. So when your communication becomes constant, safe, and expected, you slowly fade into the background. Not because you're not good enough, but because there's nothing emotionally stimulating for her mind to hold on to. Now, here's where it gets deeper. Most men confuse attention with attraction. Just because she replies doesn't mean she's thinking about you later. Just because the conversation continues doesn't mean it left any impact. You can talk to someone all day and still be completely forgettable, because without emotional weight, words don't stick, they pass through. This is why trying harder often backfires. Long messages, over-explaining, constantly checking in. It doesn't build mystery, it removes it. It doesn't create curiosity, it answers everything too quickly. And when there's no curiosity, there's nothing for her mind to return to later. Attraction needs space. It needs moments that feel slightly unfinished, slightly intriguing, slightly different from everything else she experiences. That's what creates replay. That's what makes her pause later and think, why did that stay with me? So the real problem isn't that most men don't care enough. It's that they're trying to create attraction using effort instead of understanding how the mind actually remembers. And once you understand how memory and emotion work together, you start to realize something powerful. It's not about saying more. It's about saying something that actually stays. And that leads us to the next important piece. Why some words disappear instantly while others leave a lasting imprint on her mind. To understand why some words stay in someone's mind while others disappear instantly, you need to understand how the brain actually works. Because the brain does not function like a recorder. It doesn't store every word, every sentence, or every conversation exactly as it happened. Instead, it filters. It keeps what feels important and discards what feels ordinary. And what determines what is important? Emotion. The brain is wired to remember experiences that create a feeling, not just happiness or excitement, but anything that stands out emotionally. Curiosity, surprise, tension, even confusion. That's what gets stored. That's what gets replayed. Think about your own life for a moment. You probably don't remember most conversations you had last week, but there are certain moments, certain phrases, certain interactions that stuck with you, not because they were long, but because they made you feel something. That is what psychologists often refer to as emotional imprinting. When something triggers a feeling, the brain marks it as significant. It attaches meaning to it. And because of that, it becomes easier to recall later, even without trying. Now, apply that to attraction. If your words don't create any emotional reaction, they simply pass through her awareness like background noise. She may respond in the moment, but there is nothing for her mind to return to afterward. But if something you say creates even a small emotional shift, a moment of curiosity, a spark of intrigue, a feeling she didn't expect, that's when the brain holds on to it. And here's the part most people overlook. The brain doesn't just remember emotional moments, it revisits them. That's why certain interactions replay in your mind when you're alone, when things are quiet, when your thoughts begin to wander. That replay is what creates attraction over time. Not constant communication, not endless messages, but a single moment that stays alive in her mind after you're gone. This is why someone can say very little and still be unforgettable, because what they said carried weight. It created an internal reaction, and once that reaction exists, the brain keeps returning to it, trying to understand it, relive it, or feel it again. That's the difference between being someone she talks to and someone she thinks about. So when you start focusing on emotional impact instead of just conversation, everything changes. You stop trying to fill silence. You stop trying to say the perfect thing. And instead you begin to understand that a few well-placed words can do far more than 100 forgettable ones. And that brings us to the next mistake most men make. They rely on safe, polite communication without realizing it's the fastest way to become invisible. One of the biggest reasons most men become forgettable is because they rely on what feels safe. Safe messages, safe questions, safe conversations. Hey, how are you? How was your day? Hope you're doing well. There's nothing wrong with these phrases. They're polite, they're respectful, they show basic interest. But here's the problem. They don't create any emotional reaction. And without emotion, there is no memory. Think about how many times a woman hears those exact same messages, not just from you, but from everyone else. They all sound the same. They all feel the same. So the brain treats them the same. It ignores them not because they're bad, but because they're predictable. And the human mind is wired to filter out what it has seen too many times. This is what makes safe communication invisible. You're not standing out, you're blending in. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting. Most men think being nice is enough to create attraction, but being nice only keeps the interaction comfortable. It doesn't make it memorable. There's a big difference between someone who is pleasant to talk to and someone who leaves a lasting impression. Pleasant fades, impact stays, and safe communication rarely creates impact because it doesn't challenge the mind in any way. It doesn't spark curiosity. It doesn't create imagery. It doesn't trigger emotion. It simply exists and then disappears. The brain needs something to grab onto, something slightly unexpected, something that breaks the pattern, something that makes her pause even for a second and think, that was different. Without that moment, the conversation becomes just another interaction in a long list of similar ones. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You can be consistent, polite, and always available and still be completely forgettable because attraction isn't built on repetition. It's built on emotional contrast, something that feels different from everything else she experiences. So instead of asking yourself, am I saying the right things? A better question is, does what I'm saying create any feeling at all? Because if it doesn't, it won't stay. And once you understand that, you start to realize something powerful. It's not about being louder, longer, or more frequent. It's about creating a moment that interrupts the ordinary. And that leads us to the next piece. What actually triggers that emotional reaction in the first place? So, if safe words don't work, what actually makes something stick? It comes down to one thing: emotional triggers. These are the small moments in conversation that create a reaction inside someone without them even realizing why. Not big dramatic emotions, but subtle shifts: curiosity, intrigue, a slight sense of mystery. Because the mind doesn't replay what it fully understands, it replays what feels unfinished. Think about that for a second. When something is completely clear and predictable, the brain moves on quickly. There's nothing left to explore, nothing left to question. But when something feels slightly incomplete, slightly different, slightly open-ended, the mind holds on to it. It starts asking questions. What did he mean by that? Why did that feel different? Why am I thinking about this again? That's the beginning of attraction. Not loud excitement, not constant attention, but quiet curiosity that keeps returning. This is why mystery is so powerful. Not fake mystery, not playing games, but simply not over-explaining everything. When you say something that hints at meaning, instead of fully explaining it, you create space for her mind to fill in the gaps. And the moment her mind becomes involved, she becomes emotionally invested. Another powerful trigger is imagery. Words that create a picture in her mind stay longer than words that just pass through her ears. For example, a simple statement fades quickly, but something that makes her imagine a moment, a situation, or a feeling that stays, because now she's not just hearing you, she's experiencing something internally. And the brain always prioritizes internal experience over external information. There's also the element of unexpectedness, and the moment her mind becomes involved, she becomes emotionally invested. Another powerful trigger is imagery. Words that create a picture in her mind stay longer than words that just pass through her ears. For example, a simple statement fades quickly, but something that makes her imagine a moment, a situation, or a feeling that stays, because now she's not just hearing you, she's experiencing something internally. And the brain always prioritizes internal experience over external information. There's also the element of unexpectedness. The effect disappears. Attraction is subtle. It's built in moments that don't look like much on the surface, but carry just enough emotional weight to stay in her mind. And once you understand that, you begin to realize something even more important. You don't need to say more, you need to say less, but better. And that leads to the next principle most men struggle with: why doing less often creates more impact than doing more. Once you understand emotional triggers, something starts to shift in the way you approach communication. You realize it's not about doing more, it's about doing less with intention. This is where most men struggle, because everything they've been taught tells them to stay active, stay present, keep the conversation going, don't let things go quiet. So they fill every gap: more messages, more explanations, more effort. But here's what they don't realize: constant presence removes anticipation. And without anticipation, attraction fades. Think about this carefully. If she always knows you're going to reply instantly, if she always knows you're available, if every conversation continues without pause, there's nothing for her to wonder about, nothing to think about later, nothing to miss. And the moment there's nothing to miss, there's nothing to feel. This is why space is powerful. Not because you're playing games or trying to create distance, but because space allows emotions to develop naturally. When there's a pause after a meaningful interaction, the mind doesn't shut off. It continues, it replays what was said, it tries to interpret it, it holds on to the feeling that was created. That's where attraction grows, not during constant conversation, but in the silence that follows it. Most men never allow this process to happen. They interrupt it. They send another message. They explain what they meant. They try to keep the momentum going. And in doing that, they remove the very thing that would have made her think about them later. The mind needs time to process. It needs space to feel. Without that, even the most interesting words lose their impact. Now, this doesn't mean disappearing completely or becoming cold. It means understanding timing, saying something meaningful and then stepping back, letting it sit, letting it breathe, letting her mind do what it naturally does, which is to revisit moments that felt different. This is what separates someone who is constantly talking from someone who is constantly on her mind. It's not about frequency, it's about impact followed by space. And once you combine that with something else, something even more powerful, you start to create a completely different kind of attraction. Because the next piece is what makes your words stand out instantly. It's what breaks the pattern and forces the mind to pay attention. And that is the power of novelty. If you really want to understand what makes someone unforgettable, you have to understand one simple principle. The mind is constantly scanning for what is different, not what is common, not what is expected, but what breaks the pattern. Because from a psychological standpoint, anything that stands out is treated as important. Think about it. If you hear the same type of message over and over again, your brain stops reacting to it. It becomes background noise. It requires no attention, no energy, no memory. But the moment something feels slightly different, your brain pauses, it pays attention, it marks that moment. This is what psychologists often refer to as pattern interruption. When something disrupts the normal flow of expectation, the brain automatically flags it as something worth remembering. And this is exactly what most men fail to do. They follow the same patterns, same greetings, same compliments, same predictable conversations. So even if they mean well, they disappear into the background. But the moment your words feel different from everything else she's used to, you become noticeable. Not because you tried harder, but because you broke the pattern. Now, here's the key. Novelty by itself is not enough. You can say something different, but if it carries no emotional weight, it still fades quickly. That's why the real power comes from combining difference with feeling. Something unexpected that also creates a reaction. That's what sticks. For example, a slightly unusual statement that creates curiosity will stay longer than a long explanation that feels familiar, because now her mind has something to work with, something to question, something to imagine, something to return to later. And this is where attraction begins to build in a deeper way, not from repetition, but from contrast. You become the person who feels different from everyone else she interacts with. And once that happens, something interesting occurs. Her mind starts to associate you with that feeling of difference. You're no longer just another conversation. You become a moment, a shift, something her brain doesn't fully understand yet, but wants to revisit. And when that happens, you don't need to chase attention anymore, because now her mind is already doing the work for you. And this leads us to the most important part of everything we've discussed so far. Because when you combine emotional impact, space, and novelty, you arrive at something very simple but incredibly powerful. The 3 words that trigger all of it. Now we come to the part most people have been waiting for, the 3 words. But before I tell you what they are, you need to understand something important. These words don't work because of how they sound. They work because of what they create in her mind. Because the goal is not to impress her. The goal is to make her feel something and then think about it later. So here are the 3 words. I noticed that simple, not dramatic, not romantic, not complicated, but incredibly powerful when used the right way. Because these 3 words do something most men completely fail to do. They make her feel seen, not in a general way, but in a specific personal way, and that changes everything. For example, instead of saying something generic like "you're beautiful," you say, "I notice that you smile differently when you're really enjoying yourself." Now, pause for a second. Do you feel the difference? The first one is a compliment she has probably heard many times. The second one feels personal. It feels like you are paying attention. It creates a moment, and more importantly, it creates a question in her mind. When did he notice that? What else does he notice about me? That's where the magic happens, because now her mind starts to replay the interaction, not because you said a lot, but because what you said carried meaning. These words also create imagery. They take her out of a normal conversation and place her into a moment where she becomes aware of herself through your perspective. And that's a very powerful emotional trigger, because people are naturally drawn to those who make them feel understood on a deeper level. Another example, I noticed you don't follow the crowd, or I noticed you think before you speak. These are not random compliments, they are observations. And observations feel more real than praise because they suggest effort, they suggest attention, they suggest that you see something others might have missed. And once a woman feels seen in that way, you become memorable. Not because you tried to impress her, but because you made her feel something that is rare. Now here's the key. You don't overuse this, you don't force it, you don't turn it into a script. You use it naturally when you genuinely observe something, because authenticity is what gives these words their power. Without that, they lose their impact. But when used correctly, these three simple words can stay in her mind long after the conversation ends. And that's exactly what makes them so effective. Now, the next question is just as important, because even something powerful like, this can fail if you don't use it the right way. So let's talk about that next. Now, here's where most people go wrong. They hear something works and then they overuse it. They turn it into a habit, a pattern, a script. And the moment that happens, it loses its power. Because what made those three words effective in the first place was not just the words themselves, it was the timing, the delivery, and the authenticity behind them. If you start saying, I noticed that in every conversation, it stops feeling natural. It starts feeling predictable. And once something becomes predictable, we already know what happens. The mind stops paying attention. So the first rule is simple. Don't force it. Only say it when you genuinely observe something, because when it comes from a real moment, it feels different. It lands differently. It creates that emotional reaction we've been talking about. The second mistake is over-explaining. Some men say something meaningful and then immediately ruin it by explaining what they meant. They say, I notice that you seem really thoughtful. I mean, like the way you talk and the way you explain things. And suddenly the impact disappears. Why? Because you remove the mystery. You answer the question her mind was about to explore. And remember, the mind is attracted to what it has to figure out. So when you say something meaningful, stop there. Let it sit. Let her think about it. Let her replay it. That silence is part of the attraction. The third mistake is tone. You can say the right words, but if your tone feels unsure, forced, or overly intense, it won't land the same way. The delivery needs to feel calm, natural, almost effortless, like you're simply sharing an observation, not trying to impress her. Because confidence is not about saying something powerful, it's about saying it without needing a reaction, and that's what creates emotional weight. Now, there's one more thing, timing. You don't drop something meaningful in the middle of a dry or forced conversation. It works best when there is already some level of connection, a moment, a flow, a natural interaction. That's when it lands. That's when it sticks. Because now it feels like it belongs in that moment, not something you inserted just to get a reaction. So when you combine all of this, the right words, the right timing, the right tone, and the right amount of restraint, you create something very rare, a moment that feels real. And moments like that don't disappear, they stay. And that's what brings us to the final piece of everything we've talked about. Because when you truly understand this, you realize something powerful. Attraction was never about doing more. It was always about doing what actually matters. Now, when you step back and look at everything we've covered, something becomes very clear. Attraction was never about saying more. It was never about trying harder, and it was definitely never about being perfect. It has always been about creating a moment that stays. Most people are out there talking, explaining, chasing, and trying to keep attention alive. But attention doesn't create attraction. Memory does. The people we think about are the ones who made us feel something we didn't expect, a moment that felt different, a sentence that carried weight, a feeling that stayed long after everything else faded. And that's exactly what you're doing when you shift your focus from effort to impact. You stop trying to fill every silence. You stop trying to prove yourself, and instead you create space for something real to happen. Because the truth is, a single meaningful moment can do what hours of conversation never could. It can stay in her mind when everything else disappears. It can replay itself when she's alone. It can quietly pull her back to thinking about you without you doing anything extra. That's power. Not loud, not obvious, but lasting. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop chasing attention and you start becoming someone who is naturally remembered. Now, before we close, I want to ask you something. If you watch this video all the way to the end, type "I watched till the end" in the comments. And also, tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far this reaches and who's really paying attention. If this gave you a new way to understand attraction, make sure you like the video and subscribe to Personality Psychology with Isabella, because here we don't just talk about attraction, we break down the psychology behind it so you actually understand what's happening beneath the surface. I'll see you in the next.